Hello everyone, today we talk about the first Crusade Knights equipment. It's an introductory video to trying to give a bit more of, color to what properly a Crusader knight, Frankish knight in the Latin East would have looked like, more or less. Considering we will surely make a video to that. It's not gonna be identical because today we'll try to spot some, evidence and I'd say difference on the base of Crusaders evidence specifically, but on the contemporary Western European knight, it's basically and actually the same identical thing, right? And discussing on that occasion another set of questions. But naturally, there are certain things we have to introduce as well. This is not the first time we talk about Frankish warfare during the Crusades. We actually made more than one video already on the first Crusade, specifically never talked about equipment though. And today, through this, we're gonna just touch certain broader issues as far as possible, but they're surely present. So first of all, bit of conceptual, because at the end of the day, the data is simple, but it's the way we frame them that matters, right? We have to realize that when we think about the 11th century, we are talking about a quite old time, right? We don't have a huge deal of information about what warfare looked like concretely. We have astonishing evidence, naturally, on mostly an artistical base. Think about the Bayeux tapestry, just for saying one. There is beautiful sculptural evidence, seals, as we'll see today, that interestingly enough, naturally these are all they're not reality, right? We have, of course, also archaeological evidence about the actual arms and armor employed, but one thing is finding that, another is naturally this other kind of evidence we were talking about, but also reconstructing what the broad field was about. You know that on Schwerpunkt we dedicate consistently to tactics, if anything, because that's what I specialize in let's say, in the professional life, and that's of course as far as the battlefield, the combat experience is concerned, especially the broader how to win a battle, because that's what fundamentally tactics is trying to reconstruct the broader experience, not just the technicality of it, but first and foremost the mindset, the collective training and command that go far beyond also the individual at this time already, as it's kind of always been the case. And here we analyze naturally individual evidence, so technically what individual arms and armor were about, right? Is there something stereotypical like an 11th century knight? Well, technically not, right? What we realize from equipment broadly meant is that, of course, yes, there are some essentials. If we were to talk about the hauberk, the lance, the swords, the conical helmet, the kite-shaped shield, they will take into consideration now. But the variants, and especially the way the artisanal dimension of their construction it was concerned, different types of joints, literally of armor, as we'll see today, and the interaction of different weapons at the same time. There's a bit of wargameism, kind of, I wouldn't say dogmatism, but the idea that there's a standard pack, like this is the typical 11th century knight, is perhaps not wrong when especially we compare this era of Frankish war with others, right? This is something we're discussing in that video we made some month ago about the Italo-Norman knight, when looking at certain chess pieces that we'll say, oh, that's typical Norman knight. It could have been actually Sicilian Saracens, right, as far as we are concerned. And therefore we need to be acquainted to this variety and to the fact that, yes, there was a broader homogeneity. In a pre-industrial society, mostly worked the same way. These warriors, we've seen it on a regular, but they travel extensively, right? Doesn't even make sense to say, what is a Crusader knight at this point, right? Because literally the difference might have been that these guys painted a cross on their helmet, on their shield, point. The rest, they were identical, And this is self-explanatory, right? And that's also the kind of mindset we have to get acquainted. But naturally, the variety of the individual solutions is still the proof, the hint for some broader dynamism that surely had to do with a development at this point. Some of the very first videos we made was about Byzantine cataphracts during the 10th century, right? And we were observing there how there is all a technology proper that the Byzantines were mastering at the time in equestrian warfare, in the various armor. As far as we can see, that here there is a huge debate about whether the Arab world or the Frankish world were actually at the same level, and the question is very likely they were, and therefore even here it's not much of what we can differentiate, but what we can realize about the more than else the lack or availability of sources that we can get acquainted with. Think about the kite-shaped shield. At this point, what's the point, right? Was it mediated? Came through other people? There is this also a bit of bias towards the idea that that people copy others, right? But we rarely think that sometimes the same solutions were created more or less everywhere, and that yes, that there was surely a contact, and that helped developing and homogenizing, and it's not surprised that certain modifications came more or less at the same time. But that's exactly the point. I mean, the reasons why these things were happening, including, I don't know, the fact that the stirrup was becoming, more common. It's not to be found in the idea of let's use that because we never thought of that, but rather, that there were finally the conditions for needing that, right, instrumentally to certain situations that couldn't be before. We made this, we talk about this specifically when looking at the birth of cavalry, right, during the 10th, 11th century. I mean, the idea that even the stirrup is not much of a, what is complicated in conceiving a stirrup, right, in terms of technology? Nothing. It's ridiculous. We know the stirrups were, also the simple help for remaining fixed on horseback, trying to stabilize yourself better and so on. It's something even children, I don't know, in the 6th century, in the 7th century, somewhere already in Europe used this stuff that was in material, organic material that didn't survive. But the question is, when does it become generalized to be observed regularly in the iconography? Well, at this point, it's spreading, right? If you look at the Bayeux tapestry, still not all knights have stirrup. But the reason being, let's just make sake of example, for the first time was a professional class of militarymen that was needing ever more collective training, for which straight cavalry charge became ever more frequent and ever more impacting. That is, they would need more frequently, more regularly, a stirrup to perform that. Right, not because before they didn't know it, or because they were silly that they had not thought about finding some other solutions. There were other solutions sometimes, but it's simply that the tactics were different. And another topic that we can touch about this is properly also that we expanded on Schwerpunkt is the idea that somewhat the West, that is very abused in my opinion, that the West had to, during the Crusades, fundamentally open to this new world of technology that poured in the West, talking about the trebuchet, talking about the crossbow, all these. I personally highly disbelieve this. Also in terms of Zotac equestrian, culture, capacities, etc. The more I read about this stuff, and the more I realize that there wasn't anything like that. And if anything, what the problem we have is the one of documentation, right? And as far as we can see, not just we know that Frankish knights had been all over, right? If they weren't French, they weren't Frankish, they were back in the day Vikings, right? The Varangians and so on. But they're always the same people at the end of the day. They're literally everywhere. They are in Scandinavia, they are in Normandy, they are in England, they are in Sicily. France is basically that, right? The actual cradle of that kind of warfare is the Ile-de-France and properly Western Francia at this point. So never think that the Norman knights, for example, had anything that distinguished them from Western Frankish knights. They were Western Frankish, if anything, because Normandy was in Western Francia, but also because they technically didn't have, they had developed that kind of cavalry just because of the surroundings, right? The first Scandinavian settlers weren't actually much about that, right? It's a myth that Vikings didn't have good cavalry or didn't make large use of them. Actually, they did, but the technicality here, the tactics, the political and social context were very different, at least. But these troops were everywhere. They were in Russia. They were at the service of Constantinople. They were in service. We've seen them in Manzikert, right? But we're in the service even of Muslim powers, right? They escorted pilgrims to the Holy Land. So making any kind of saying, from 1099, finally, the West opened to this other world. They emerged from the dark ages. It doesn't mean anything, right? In Spain, we find, for example, during his hands of the early Reconquista, certain technological advancements that objectively superseded chronologically even France and Italy. We find, in fact, these knights pretty much everywhere, right? The Crusades didn't begin with the Near East. They began with Spain. They began with Sicily. They began with this further contact with the rest. And once again, more or less tactics were similar, right? In this sedentarized world, right? There could be a more or less feudal society, and that's where, in fact, we have to look at very seriously at the fact that the most feudal and therefore the place that could develop the heaviest cavalry ever was Western Francia, right? And this is actually remarked by the same Byzantines. Read Anna Komnena, what she thought about the Normans, what she thought about the Celts, that is, the Western Franks, as she called them in a classicistic sense. And we see there that these guys are arriving at the gates of Constantinople and eventually crossing for Asia Minor, the Near East. They displayed, from just banal evidence we can find here, a military culture and a set of know-how of armament and equipment in general that had nothing to envy to these guys. On the contrary, right? And surely their military culture was much more feudal and equestrian in nature than it was the Byzantine or the Arab one, right? And that is not to say that, or the Turkic one, if we really want, and we can't say, I don't know, that the Byzantines or the Turks weren't about cavalry, because fundamentally, even for them, it was important, but that tells you how actually more advanced under that specific heavy cavalry, heavily armored cavalrymen and thickly packed, formations for the sake of charge, the West was already about, right? The eastern we go, the more we see a lightening, right? An increase of missile. And this is pretty evident if you look at the extremes of the Seljuks, right? It had these swarms of horse archers basically without any armor and just a tiny but ultra, let's say, elite of a heavy cavalryman. But this would be felt during Crusade, but also much was shared. Could say Constantinople was something in between. But let's say this is just to give a background about the fact that there's no difference compared to what we think. Even about the mounts, we made a video last year. I thought that was interesting. It was based on a guy's article that I quoted there, that observed how there is no evidence actually, both nor in the Near East nor in Spain, that the Westerners had, let's say, not bad, but let's say unfit mounts to, for example, the weather, the climate there, or the breeds of the other guys. I mean, the myth, for example, that Crusading cavalry couldn't pursue the lighter Turks, it's false. We find evidence of Crusader knights proper pursuing, right? And this is not to say that these were kind of special, magical, troopers that I don't know. Even if they had fought and they were heavy, that they could go on fine. Of course, there were some limits of that kind, but still, individually, and also certain fresh units could do that. So this speaks for, in part, let's say, a cavalry that hadn't definitely in the West, specialized so much as it would reach in the 13th, when you really start seeing something happening there with introduction of also plate armor, but not only in general. It's really about the breeds and a bit everything, the consistent having of, we made a video, right, on this, on armor, on equipment, so that will change a big deal even if apparently this has not been stressed excessively in the later military developments, especially in terms of tactical specialization on the field with other units. But speaking of the 11th century, we're talking of a reality that even just the one of chivalry was extremely fluid, right? The idea of with a typical 11th century knight, right? Today we look just at equipment. We could probably talk about horses, but the point is that it's still a fighter, a warrior that can adapt to many more contexts on a regular basis on the battlefield, right? That is not to say that the 13th century knight couldn't, because that's a peak of professionalism. They could fight literally in every single situation with every single kind of weapon. Erase from your mind that knights didn't use crossbows, or bows and on horseback, but these guys could fight in every situation, dismounted. Look at Norman sources. Normally, you find the same exact people depicted fighting on foot and on horseback. Even if you look at the Battle of Hastings, it's not that the Saxons, differ particularly from the Normans, right? They are basically the same people, just for reasons that we have already discussed. Actually, we made a video on Anglo-Saxon military organization, some photo in the shield wall, let's call it in this way. But even in there, in fact, it's a bit stereotypical. The fact that that those guys fought just on foot, the Normans fought on horseback. There's this massive prejudice also regarding Anglo-Saxon warfare. There's allegedly no traditional mounted warfare. That's actually wrong, right? We can easily see it just if you study the history of Harold Godwinson and where he fought and how he fought. In Normandy, like a Norman, right? In England, like an Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Danish at that point. In Wales, actually adapting even in there to the so speaking wargamistically into these guys fought like that and those others in there, it's wrong, right? And we would be surprised actually by even how the Crusaders resembled in practice the same people that were fighting in the Near East, right? Especially the Egyptians that had a few to do technically with the Seljuk military organization. They were much more sedentary, much more Sado-like. In fact, they placed more emphasis on infantry than the Turks. And they didn't differ substantially, even just from the Franks. Styles, like the idea that there is a Western style, Eastern style, especially at this time, doesn't make great deal of sense. First of all, because the same Crusaders actually adopted arms and armor of the same places. Secondly, because what's better to kill someone, a straight blade or a curved blade, right? It's like asking whether it's a white or black cat is better to catch a mice, right? To catch mice, it doesn't make sense, right? And that's the kind of idea we should get acquainted to be, because there is somebody say, well, but there are differences in that. Yes, there are. But it's hardly a difference that will make a battle's outcome, right? And in order to explain this, we mostly study the Kampfkriege and we reiterate certain concepts here and there. Today we don't talk specifically about tactics, but it's worth remembering that when you have to fight someone, what counts is not what you have in your hands, but how much you want to kill the person in front of you. And that's not something that a sword can confer you, right? Doesn't matter how important that can come to play at certain limited levels. But is there kind of a standard 11th century Frankish knight, though? No, right? There isn't. There's just something, approximated. We could quote, for example, there are some beautiful reliefs from the Modena Cathedral in Italy dated to 1099 to 1106. I've inserted even here that's a hell of a picture of what a Western knight could be at the time. The changes wouldn't be even visible for 100 years from the end of the 11th century. That is also just to say how gradual transformations were, but mostly they would occur in around the design of helmet and shield. Even in here, considering that by the time of the First Crusade, we mostly think of the kite-shaped shield, but technically they were round around. This has to do naturally also with with the conditions you have to fight. It's obvious that everything has its pros and cons, right? Larger shield, more protection, less mobility, more fatigue, right? And vice versa. So it's kind of understandable. You can't cheat with that. So it's not necessarily that one is better than the other, right? It depends on the situation. The situation changes even during the same battle. So those are things you can't properly calculate even beforehand, right? Speaking of armor, of course, we think of the hauberk, named in in different ways: the asperkot, the ausberg, the ausberg, the hauberk. There are plenty of names with that. Was male, fundamentally single or double. Are sometimes recorded as to be so closely interwoven that even a dagger point couldn't penetrate its lengths, right? This varied because even in there is substantial difference in how it's going to turn out, and there was no standardization in this sense. Then there was a quilted tunic, normally called the aketon or gambesson, famously enough, that was worn under the hauberk, but sometimes actually also over it. And this is actually an important thing to stress, because we see it, for example, in the Byzantine cataphracts at this time. The gambesson, this is extra weight, telling you the truth, but it can't really do miracles, considering that most blows do not come at the right angle to deliver all the forces there. It's also an extra way to isolate, even for temperature in a sense, but it can't really offer an extra protection. And this in fact, even wearing it over the hauberk was a thing. Mail, as you often forget, this was often gilded or silvered, more often even blackened, something that would be done up to the 7th century to prevent from rust. And we believe that most, not most, but a large part of these armor were actually painted or enameled, right? We find it clearly more with helmets in the Bayeux tapestry. They're colored, and we have a lot of manuscripts from the 12th, 13th centuries showing actually a mail in different color, like red or green. That it's not that it could. Sometimes we find them blue because they can resemble the gray or the dark, and kind of towards the black color, with some reflection. No, but we think they were colored, right? That there is hardly something more colored in history like a medieval battle, right? So this idea of all gray, all iron looking is actually, in part not entirely the truth. Helmets normally came out through these patterns from the early Middle Ages. Think about the Spangen helmet. It's mostly the conical form with nasals at this point. All others without such kind of nasal would actually be found as late as the 14th century, right? But already by the mid-13th, it would have been considered outdated. Surely not, however, for a First Crusade knight. Principal weapons would be lance, sword, and mace, and I think the use of these are pretty evident. Lance is mostly about mounted combat, and at this point, actually, the length was still relative. Some of these lances were used properly to lance them, right? So they were used both as spears, let's say, in lances, Look at the Bayeux tapestry, the softening up of the shield walls with these javelins before the charge. So this is something that would gradually change over time with the crochet grip, the famous thing. But actually, these grips, overarm, underarm, whatever, thrown right for the length, or crochet, were used at every single, or double hand grip, right? Were used in every single damn moment in history, right? So it's not that a 13th century knight wouldn't use them like that. It's just that tendentially, in order to perform a cavalry charge, the preferred thing tended to be in thickly packed formation, with all these lances in the front. Naturally, they used to charge at each other, so the objective was mostly smashing to the person's face and or chest, so that's where eventually armor would develop consistently with pectorals, with chest plates that in fact appear. This time we'll talk about it later when discussing the armor of Eustace of Boulogne from the Bayeux tapestry, but as you know, there would be visors developing between the 12th and 13th century, exactly because the enemy would be just smash their faces during the charge mostly, and that indicates how, in fact, exactly at that point, the cavalry charge in thickly packed formations was reaching its apex, so that those areas would be ever more exposed. But once again, it depends on how much you want to be protected, and still at this point, of course, that was an important need. Consider, of course, that this, the economical possibilities of knights were different at this time from the one of the 13th century. Even in there would be a more gradual specialization. Today, we do not talk of the squires, of the sergeants, and these other guys. We'll do it on another occasion. But naturally, there was all a gradation of armoredness, let's say, that was functional, in fact, even to speed, right? And as we know, we have seen before, usually, especially in the Near East, most of the enemies the Crusaders would face were less armored on average than the Crusaders. Of course, there were ultra heavily armored cavalrymen among the Turks, among the Fatimids, I've seen also among the Armenians. We'll talk about them, the Byzantines, and so on. They resembled a lot of each other, right? Think about even the Turcopoles that we made a video on. Well, those begin stereotypically as lighter troops, but at the end of the day, they also get Frankicized, because that actually happened. Some of them were actual knights equal to the Frankish ones, right? The lengths at the end of the 11th century was usually about 7 to 8, sometimes even up to 9 feet long, right? It was made often in ash or pine, albeit we find also other wood types. And at this point, the crochet grip we were saying before was already probably prevalent, at least in as far as the charge was concerned, naturally, and that would be the most functional way at that point. Speaking of the sword, the lance has this capacity, of course, hitting at a distance. So let's say compensating also for those. Let's say the lance in itself, a cavalry one, it's designed to fit this sense of frontal charge, so that you have this axis that at the end of the day shifts just a few when you're charging straight against someone else. The sword has a different use, and it's not, you can't charge with a sword technically. There are all specific moves that we know it because modern cavalry, it's very well documented, without breaking your shoulder or elbow, because it's not that you hit another, you're charging at 45 kilometers per hour. There's another guy 45 kilometers per hour going against you, so whatever you hit at 90 kilometers per hour. And if you don't hit right, if you don't have the right timing, and this tells you what these guys were, how intensely they were trained already at the time, simply, your armor breaks like a cracker, right? And either your elbow or your shoulder, and it's surely something you don't want. But specifically, the sword is for kind of more close combat, and especially for cutting where you can actually cut. And we have to remember that while armor, metal armor at this point is generally sword-proof, right? And that's what it's considered, especially for cutting, for cutting blows. And this is not much because for a mechanical reason, but mostly for a biological one, because cuts could be, lethal, right? Not much because of the bleeding, but because of the infection later. So the problem in the development of mail was preventing from that to happen. I mean, you could take massive blows that would bleed you from the inside, that would break your bones. What these guys were exposed to on a regular basis, but that was, a broken bone was far better than having, maybe not far better, because technically even a broken bone can infect, can cause problems, even at different substantial time of distance. But it's better than cutting, but the majority of troopers that these guys would have to fight, both in Europe and wherever they went to fight, were less armored, right? They had armor that could be cut through more easily, at least. Don't believe that the Gambizon, for example, is, just cut like butter, right? You have to cut it in a specific way. That the sword has to be also, well sharpened and treated in a certain way. But generally speaking, it's, you can cut and you can butcher, right? And always consider that, cutting weapons or traumatic weapons are mostly used, as we'll see also for the mace now, usually by the elite, right? The idea that even falchions, for example, would be used by the peasants, it's not much the case, right? Unless they were fighting against one another. But the point is that just a knight would have had the degree of protection loaded in armor that was virtually impenetrable with the average weapons you could find there. Naturally, you could simply put the guy down. In other ways, you could stick, your knives into his face and all this stuff. So you can't knock him out. You can exhaust him. You can throw blows at him, etc. But the guy who would have enough protection to come as close to cut and to traumatize is an armored guy that would find here swarms of lightly armored troops, so that it could make a bath of blood amidst, right? The mace too, because the mace, and this seems to have been, I don't know how much this topic is researched, but we came to the realization that mace has an important meaning in various cultures, because it exactly exemplifies the capacity of coming close to the enemy to kill him. This was, we find it among the Normans and Hastings, among the Seljuks, the idea that the mace was the weapon of the leader that could come close to the enemy to smash, but also to smash because it had to traumatize under armor, so to fight against other armored opponents. So elite versus elite, the idea of the champions that fight among each other. And it's the same reason at the end of the day, while you find so many traumatic weapons, hammers, things like it, towards the 15th century, when plate armor is completely taking over the elite, and these knights fight basically with, not with a sword, but with maces, because they have to break through, right? Unless it's a kind of very heavy sword that is also meant to break the joints, to give very heavy, powerful blows, etc. But it's definitely not the 11th century sword that is mostly meant to cut through lightly armored or even unarmored opponents. There are other issues about the composition of the hauberk. There were extra, the hauberk was, you see it even famously in the Bayeux tapestry, was taken off from the above, right? So there is this kind of odd trouser effect in the same Bayeux tapestries, for which some people have believed that the hauberk could be dressed, yes, also as a sort of trouser-like, but it's not shown like that. And however, there were still other pieces of armor you could put around your thighs, other places, to reinforce in fact, protection in that sense. And we'll see it better with Eustace of Boulogne. Anna Komnena reports that the Norman hauberk was fully capable of resisting arrows and made the wearer, quote, almost if not completely invulnerable, right? And probably she's referring, however, about lighter arrows, such as the ones of the Turks, that at the end of the day, it's the same ones that, the Byzantines used. Think about the Kumans, all they had in their ranks and so on. We find in a Western Frankish manuscript in the mid-11th century a shorter hauberk at the bottom, but with long sleeves. So that's mostly the kind of modifications you can find. Talk of extra layers, though, that would be consistent protection, but would add naturally to weight and fatigue. So the kite shield had a bronze or iron boss. It was hung around the neck and against the left shoulder by a strap. There were alternatives to this. It's going to be seen different systems of in the Bayeux tapestry. Also, the Byzantine style grip was another one, but let's say we'll see it in another occasion. Shields were of wood. They could, however, be pierced through by a strong lance thrust. Consider that technically even a double-handed axe could break through armor, right? It was a very heavy blow, but you needed kind of an athlete to do something like that. But still, the trauma within it, even without breaking, would have been massive. Anna Komnena describes the shield face as smooth and shiny, right? And that it could repel any arrow fired against it. And we know, however, that by the late 11th century, some shields were reinforced by a thin sheet of metal that actually adding protection. Consider at this point there are still crossbows around. Literally, I wanted to say already, but it's technically correct to say still, because crossbows never disappeared. They had always been there during the ancient world and the early Middle Ages, and in places where you don't even think there wasn't much of a military development there. So it had always been a thing. At this point, it's being reinforced. In fact, Anna Komnena even speaks of that and says specifically that some armor could be pierced through, right, so by these most powerful blows. Speaking of maces, we already said basically what we wanted to point out with those, but that's a side. We stressed the fact it was a side weapon such as that. Stocks, they would become more, more fashionable by the 13th century, especially with the appearance of plate armor and the ultra hemming of armor in a sense, also enclosing ever more the knight. So they would be more functional, but we can find many other. Knights could bring with them 2 or even 3 swords in combat. They were on the saddle. They specifically had them worn, and it's pretty much obvious. Squires would bring new lances. It would be the thing that would be more likely to be broken in combat. Other side weapons could be axes, that are documented exactly here in a seal we're going to see afterwards in Kingdom of Jerusalem, the time of the First Crusade, or rightly afterwards, and actually missile weapons such as bows and crossbows, even if there is no, that I know, as specific evidence in this case for knights, etc., but they're there, right? And we know that these weapons were common on the battlefields, right? If you have just seen the Bayeux tapestry, you have these guys, these bowmen running around the knights while they fight, or even opening the fight, actually, as it would be normal. And speaking always of the tapestry, and more specifically of the figure depicted representing Eustace of Boulogne, Well, here, this guy is an example of ultra armored, right? So much that Anna Komnene speaks of Norman knights as kataphractoi, right? So the cataphractos in Greek, means simply armored. So it's not that the cataphracts were, there is this semantic ambiguity, but we mostly call cataphracts today, in a bit of a more modernized sense, the ultra heavy klibanophoroi that we made a video about and that were to be found there. Cataphract is it's a much looser, more flexible term than that. Also, we mostly associate the term to also have, metal armored horse, which was something very rare, and that's why when you look at the Byzantine klibanophoroi in the 10th century, you see there, we're talking about a huge asset the state had to finance, right, as to field something that literally could not meet an equal opponent on the field. But we're talking about major pitched battles. These guys were dramatically limited in number because the sheer amount of resources to field them was something barely sustainable. The picture here in the Bayeux tapestry shows an addition of mail protection for forearms and lower leg. So literally, it's a double layer, right, which appears actually on only few figures, including the one of Eustace, and some of them are actually also symmetric in the sense that they wear a sleeve on the right arm only, for example. This is very fascinating because you understand that in the left arm would have been protected by the shield, usually, and therefore, you didn't want to spend which was enough to protect, mostly given the ratio, resistance, cumbersome, say, weight, things of this kind, whereas the right arm would be more exposed, and therefore you wanted to protect it with a double layer of mail. This is very important because it shows you how already at this time there would be multiple layers of armor worn, and you find also this chest plate for other protecting the heart, and that's a big deal. That's perhaps what Amna Komnene in fact refers to when you think of the cataphracts among the Normans. And that's a hell of a heavy cavalry, man, right? Speaking of horse armor, they would mostly use gambesson as well, probably much more than we think here. There is probably debate because naturally, also from an archaeological point of view, this the gambesson organic material would perish more easily. So it's difficult even to document. At a certain point, iconography doesn't show it excessively. We mostly see naked horses. But it's worth mentioning that also in Byzantine context, we find, the Hungarians in the 11th century battle described as having this horses with a breastplate, technically. And we know that breastplates, head plates, had been out there since antiquity. I mean, it doesn't make so much sense to believe that some knight wouldn't have such kind of protection. The question is, how effective is that, right? And that's why you should wonder also the cost-benefits ratio, not much in terms of the individual that surely had all the interest to remain personally alive, but technically the incidence of literally, you have to simply ask yourself how much does a human life cost, right? And in a field, especially when you are not the guy who fights in first, but the one who pays for that, and the society pays for that, and you'll find that it was better to invest, for example, in effectiveness of collective training than in overloading these guys with armor, right? So there is always a balance, and if we don't find a great deal of that, it's not because nobody came up with the idea of let's put plate to protect ourselves, like in later times, but simply, can we afford this? Is it effective? Is it not effective? This is something important to wonder. So yes, there would be actually plate armor, and this is very controversial because even the appearance of plate armor sometimes is not clearly depicted, because we see these smooth surfaces on iconographic. We don't know whether it's kind of leather. We don't know if it is another, maybe it's even tissue. As with the gambas, as we were saying before, some depictions are very crude. We can't distinguish it, from metal. But yes, as early as this time, there could have been, right? The Byzantine, what is that? Niketas Koniates says it pretty explicitly about the Hungarian knights, right? And we know that even Hungarian knights, for the sources we have about them, on a regular basis weren't armored like that. But it's pretty obvious that the elite would wear some of that stuff. After all, plate was, even the helmet is plate armor, right? So, and that's where in fact they protect their head, the most important part of their body with. So, in combat, that's something you would think about. And if armor came out the way it was, we see depicted, with an important degree of homogeneity, well, that's because evidently they knew how make it be at that point. So, yeah, I mean, we discussed the equipment. So what about the crusading character? Would be a crusader knight distinguished from others? Well, basically not, right? Some say, well, in the Near East it's normally hotter, so they probably wore lighter equipment sometimes. Yeah, I mean, on average, yes, it's possible. We know that, it's not that Southern Europe in summer, but during the war season is much different at some point. And it's not about even what's the temperature out here, but how heated the guy literally cooked he becomes. It's plenty of evidence, but even in Central Europe, I don't know, easily also in Northern Europe, that, where in summer, that certain knights would be exhausted, literally. They would prefer to literally fight without armor. We have evidence of this, right? This is not the regular thing, but say in conditions especially of, some would simply break. We know of guys that literally died of thirst / exhaustion, heat, right? They would simply collapse like that, and it's normal. We know it happens. But others would literally prefer to fight without armor. Others would say, okay, at least during combat I have to wear it, even if I'm literally dying of heat and thirst, right? And you can't abandon the post, right? Of course, the squires would have drink for their masters, but it's not that also squires are always literally there, or that they're not in danger, that they can intervene at all times. So imagine, we have it, we have seen it many times in these medieval battles, the literal exhaustion, remaining under the sun for hours and hours during combat with adrenaline going on like crazy, the enemies lighting in fires to smoke the enemy. I mean, some of the worst tortures you can imagine, right? But these guys were somewhat habituated to this, because at the end of the day, warfare was more or less the same everywhere. It is true, yes, in the Near East, this thing of heat would be, we've seen it at Hattin, we've seen it many other Crusade battles we documented. There's a whole playlist about medieval battles we made here. But the sun would do its cooking job enough well by itself. So yes, it is technically possible that there were lighter solutions on average, right? But don't think that the climate actually dictates the degree of armoredness of a trooper. Mm-hmm. It's just one factor among many others that make it probably virtually influent, right? Think just even as we were saying before, think about the Seljuks that on a regular base from the steppes would come with a almost completely unarmored army, numerically speaking, because they're all horse archers, basically, except the ultra elite. The Egyptians had a different degree, as we were saying before, of let's say, of ranges of armoredness. We can't speak of that. But that's what you use in combat. It's not that it's because in Syria in July you're going necessarily to use less armor. It depends how you want to die, fundamentally. And the surely also the here we're talking just about knights, right? So this were like 1/10 of the arm, right? The rest would be helping them and cooperating with them on the field in ways that we have partially analyzed. We made a video on crusading tactics at some point, but there is much to add actually about the interaction of cavalry and infantry, especially because it's very important, even probably at least for some European developments eventually, at least that there can be a parallelism between the two things. But obviously what would distinguish a crusader would be the cross, right? And they would wear this on the helmet, the gonfalon, of course, having it painted on the shield, right? And an English knight of the First Crusade is described as having crosses on his helmet, shield, saddle, and horse accoutrements. And certainly, especially during the earlier Crusades, when we don't see an exceptional amount of surcoats, albeit probably the word there, some of the Crusaders would wear the cross on the shield and or the helmet, right? We know that shields were painted in bright colors. This is even in Bayeux tapestry. Albert Ove describes the Crusaders at Antioch in 1097 having, quote, shields of gold, green, red, and other colors. That's what we were saying about before, about the colorful image of a medieval army. There is seemingly something I never thought of, honestly, this tendency of seeing, let's say, less crosses being worn in the later Crusade period. Albeit we know, naturally, that many, I mean, think about the monastic chivalric orders, but also other crusaders would always wear the cross in their. Here we're talking specifically on themselves, right? The gonfalons, the standards, and so on would always have this vice, but there is maybe a tendency that is to be observed, however, later in time. Not just of the diversification. I mean, when the Latin states were created, naturally they assumed certain symbols on the local. They were mostly about crosses at the same time. But also there would be thieves, there would be different forms of identification. So also many crusaders literally, let's say, stopped wearing them as they fulfilled their pilgrims' vows, right? And this includes those who actually settled, right? Those few that actually remained. And also some people never did, not just because it was full of non-Christians in Crusaders' armies, but also because, there was literally everyone around. Knights would be the most responsible, let's say, in terms of also symbolism of appearance and moral boosting because of their looks and so on. So they would naturally wear the cross, right? But the idea is that towards the 13th century, Crusades also started becoming something more complicated, not just because things had gone downhill mostly from the end of the 12th century in the Latin East, but simply because there would be a kind of we can say is more national character of these expeditions. I mean, think about the French Crusades in Egypt, eventually, in the 13th century. I mean, it was France that arrived with its own contingent. It was England that was coming with its own contingent. So, naturally, they all wore the cross, but sometimes it was better to show, who you were in front of the other crusaders rather than in front of the enemy or in front of whoever. I mean, everybody knew that you were Christian and you were there for a vow for the Holy Coast. So there is, on average, a decrease, apparently, of the display of crosses towards the end of the Crusades. But this is just anecdotal, right? Literally for the sake of, what would be the appearance of a crusader. What I would like to conclude on are three evidences from properly, yes, the same, either the very beginning of the 12th or the even the same time of First Crusade, or right afterwards. For the sake of completion, we could also speak of broader 12th century evidence, because for most of the century, equipment would remain unburied, as we've seen. But since we're speaking today specifically a Frankish knight of the First Crusade, what it would look like, right? A guy like Bohemond of Taranto, or Godfrey of Bouillon. Well, we have some interesting evidence that reflects what also we usually do not take, perhaps at least immediately, into adequate consideration, that the Crusaders would wear mostly a very similar gear to the one of the local Near Eastern troopers, right? And this is pretty understandable and self-explanatory, but naturally, since most of the sources that we have about the Crusades are, West ones, because of course there's plenty of of other Christian sources of the Near East, of Muslim sources, but let's say we've seen many times, especially looking at battles, that the Westerners had a much more critical and kind of, could say, even more modern, secular, even if we can use these terms, type of historiography that dates back to, I don't know, the Hellenic tradition, whatever. There is a very different way the Westerners tell their stories. They're much more complete and rich in details, right? And not always. This is also an average, but even in here there is this iconography, there are illuminations, and so on. And of course, a Western author, even if he had been at Crusades himself, writing in France or in Germany or wherever, well, they would tendentially represent, even because they weren't the authors, right? Those who made the illuminations would represent the knights with styles that were modeled on whatever were the ones of Western Europe at the time, that were mastered by artists that never even been at the Crusades or didn't know excessively much what it looked like back then, and they mostly thought of what they saw in Europe, right? As we were saying before, it's not that there was this huge difference, but at the same time, when you compare these sources, this evidence with Eastern illuminations, you find very, very different things. And this is kind of normal. I mean, we all know the anachronisms, even of much later sources of, pick up 15th century illumination, talking about the First Crusade, you will hardly see any difference between the Saracens and the Crusaders. They basically wear all Western armor at the time. It's very rare to see a Western author, a Western artist representing a Saracen with an actually Eastern-looking gear, aside from the anachronism across the centuries, but literally also what they thought the Muslims were at that time, right, and their own time. But we have pretty reliable, or at least meaningful evidence in this sense from those very years. So as I was saying before, at some point we will cover properly the 12th century iconography. Here we could speak about it, referring to the years of the First Crusade, but we will leave this stuff for another video, because even if the equipment was similar, still the evidence is for the 12th, for the mid or early, but not the actual. We don't know, at least for sure, whether these were the beginnings of the 12th century. So at least we know it's not exactly that period. There is naturally evidence that we can't even date properly, whether between the 11th or the 12th century. So here, just 3 examples to make it simple. One is a coin of Baldwin II, Count of Edessa. This is dated between 1100 and 1118. This is at the National Library Cabinet de Médailles in Paris. So this is fascinating, because coins coming from the Latin East surely depict a mixture of earlier native designs plus new Frankish forms, right? We don't know who these artists were, I believe, right? They might have been natives, they might have been Europeans, we don't know. But this is a very early evidence, right? This coin. so also very crudely represented, and that unfortunately doesn't help to understand much. But we definitely have a range of these coins from the county of Edessa that show surely a Western Knight, but surely a lot of Armenian and Artukid Turkish influence in equipment. And this coin specifically, we have Count Baldwin with a very European form of helmet, with a forward angled crown. But there is an interesting distinction made between the body of his armor and the sleeves, because it seems as this could be a design accident, but that objectively the male sleeves are the ones of an hauberk, while the body armor is a sleeveless lamellar cuirass, typical of the Middle Eastern style. That is to say, this guy was also an extra heavily armored guy, either wearing literally an hauberk, an integral one, and over like a lamellar armor. This is we find it even among the Byzantine Klebanophori in the previous century. But this the one the time the 10th, 11th century. Or there could have been maybe already, but I don't know if it's really at the time. You should check, a solution for which, yes, you have the lamellar body armor, but then the sleeves are just attached to it, and you don't have the full hauberk underneath. But I don't think it's actually a solution. It could be literally, there were multiple layers, sometimes even 3 or 4, between gambesson, mail, lamellar, maybe other gambesson, as we were saying before. So this is quite fascinating, and naturally Baldwin, as a count of Edessa, would wear the most magnificent armor. That is not even necessarily the one that he would use in combat, because let's be honest about this, that there was a way of representing knights, usually with the heaviest equipment ever. The heaviest breed of horse breed, the heaviest armor. But we know, in fact, that most knights would have not stallions but runners in combat. That also they would have also lighter equipment is mostly believed. Also considered that they weren't so rich, so swimming in gold to have always complete equipment. So we were always talking about a materially poor world with dramatically precarious possibility of availability of material. So an armor costs a freaking lot, and you may, as we were saying before, it might have been even uncomfortable, or at the moment not even tactically advisable to wear it, right? Especially if your unit has just to pursue, has there is all a cost of weight. We're talking about sheer physics, energy consumed and so on. Then we have another coin of Baldwin II from roughly the same years, basically the second decade of the 12th century, still from the Cabinet de Médailles at the National Library in Paris. Here, Baldwin wears a short-sleeved garment and a body armor that may easily be an hauberk, but there are some horizontal and vertical patterns that do not really help to understand, but it seems like to be so. And what is striking here is his shield, that for being an early 12th century one is pretty small, right? And it may reflect, in this sense, a Byzantine Armenian influence. We have seen it, the Klebanophori usually had the smaller shield, because you're so heavily armored that the shield at some point is not even fit. I mean, it's like in the 15th century, right? Shields disappear for knights, or at least in tournaments, you see they're always smaller, because what's the point? You're covered in plate armor, right? So here it's a bit the same thing at the end of the day. You still need a shield, but it's smaller, because you're already overloaded. You don't need more than that much. The same goes for the Muslims at some level. So also the guy's probably wearing a hat, because the shape is pretty weird and it doesn't seem to be fitting like a helmet. Finally, there is a seal of Geoffroy de Bouillon, Godfrey Bouillon, as Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, right? So this is from Jerusalem, or at least Palestine at this point. And this dates literally between 1099, right, and 1100. So the same, basically a year after the same year of the capture of Jerusalem. This is from Prower, Histoire du Royaume Latin de Jérusalem. The seal, as we were saying, that is bigger than coins normally, and normally shows, in fact, a more detailed military costume. And here, Geoffroy wears a conical helmet, the most interesting part of which is the extension to protect his neck, right? This is also something you don't usually find, right? He has a spear and a kite-shaped shield, but just for saying look at even some Carolingian art that shows classical helmets, neck guard, this stuff. You would say, oh, that's kind of artistical. We don't know. Actually, it could have been they used something like that. The fact that we don't have archaeological finds of that, it's still speaking for those times. It's like we don't know. There might have easily been something like that. Alright, so I hope broadly, if you have, I realize here we surpassed 3,000 subscribers, so there is a lot of people that have subscribed recently, 200 in the last month, so I have probably repeated something you can find in other videos, but today we really wanted to make a kind of stereotypical image of a first Crusade knight, right, and his equipment. And therefore we have seen mostly what is fascinating from this evidence, the commixtion of Frankish and Eastern armor in actually here the official representations, such as the coins and seals. And naturally this is still iconography, so we don't have to believe it's 100%, but it still shows predictably a local influence in armor, and also with these features that are somewhat fascinating, right? A lamellar armor for plus Habsburg, like you would find actually in other contexts, like the Byzantine one and so on, and with Middle Eastern influences, and also neck guard to a typical conical helmet you can find all over Europe and that you don't, in fact, see very much represented, right? And why would it have been added, right? Because there was some specific way of finding it would required? Well, probably not, right? But considering, neck guards normally are used to protect from blows from the upper side, right? It's like when you see in the Roman Empire, you see contexts where there is a lot of cavalry, so you see the neck guard appearing, especially when people fight dismounted in part. So think about the various Roman imperial Gallic helmets, right? There is a pretty evidence there. Neck guards deriving from Celtic warfare. There were the word spatae and the blows from the upper side. So yeah, would have been the Near East a place like in the 11th century for which a Western Frankish knight would feel the need to keep himself like that? Probably not, right? But here what the point we can make is that it's really about the art, right? It's really about what these people had in their mind to represent for a local tradition that probably was connected with real elements that were like that, right? Because, a neck guard is useful in any circumstances. You don't really need to have a dramatic emphasis on mounted, dismounted combat to think of blows coming from the above to wear that. It's still a neck guard. It's useful in every freak situation, every kind of warfare, right? So, but it appears there. So this could mean that yes, that there were certain styles that maybe in the West were ignoring a certain type of a certain element, right? More less than than likely, because methodologically, when you see an overwhelming evidence where a certain feature is lacking, you tend to say, okay, well, but it probably wasn't. If there was something like that, it wasn't so frequent, right? Probably, right? But it might have been for some reason that also we get tricked by iconography, and that we weren't there. So the fact that somebody would give us this information is still meaningful, and we have to take it among the others and to contemplate the possibility of this thing existing, or at least to being deemed to be possible by the freaking not king, but the ruler of Jerusalem in that case, of Godfrey of Bouillon. But that is a meaningful thing to do. This symbolism is also not secularized. There is a symbol, a meaning attached that is important. It would be important to retrace, and compare with other armor. You never cease, because at this point, yes, we're not very well documented, but still we're enough documented to have an enormous amount of stuff to compare, right, and to draw information from. All right. So we will naturally keep talking about these topics. As you know, I want to make a video for every single type of fighter that you can imagine. In medieval Europe, this was pretty much it. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to this channel if you are interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.